Hey y'all, we are here with Dr. Sabrina Bradbury-Segal. She is an amazing part of the Little Humans Big Dreams team. And today we are going to talk a little bit about some tips for parents to help children cope with anxiety or depression now that the world is opening up again and kids are going to go back to school. What are some tools and techniques that teens and kids can use to help ease the anxiety, and how can parents best help their kids when going back to school? So Sabrina, I know this is gonna definitely be a challenge this year, this upcoming fall for kids, being in a group in the cafeteria or being in a classroom full of kids. I know, for example, my nieces, they haven't been back to school since COVID started. So I know it's gonna be a big adjustment. So can you talk a little bit about first of all, like maybe the impacts of COVID on like the brain and the body and hormones and things of that nature. And then we can talk about like, what are things that parents can do, because parents are also experiencing anxiety. So how can they help themselves to help their kids too? Mm-hmm. I know that was a lot, but.
Well, I'll try to keep it concise because there's so much that I can share on this topic and what's happened. My take on the COVID situation is that we are just now starting to see the fallout with mental health, and we're going to continue to see that fallout for years, if not decades following, unfortunately. So we know in terms of statistics that anxiety has increased more than a third in the general population, same with depression since the COVID-19 pandemic started. And we know that everyone is at risk for these conditions, but our children, our adolescents are particularly vulnerable. They've missed not only the interactions, the sort of normal social development stages, but they've missed milestones in their lives. And these are sometimes milestones that can be considered rites of passage as they mature into adulthood, things like that. So every sort of different demographic of human being is going to be impacted from this pandemic in a different way. And I think it's important to be cognizant of the different age groups and where children are in development and how they could be impacted differently. So the first thing I'll say when it comes to trying to help your child adjust to this sort of going back to school or going back into the world is that, we talk about the stigma of mental health, and there has been a huge stigma for years and years about mental illness and about therapy, and that people basically have negative attitudes towards it. We're seeing a huge shift. We're seeing a shift towards, wow, this perspective of mental health is something that we all need to fight for. We all need to protect. We all have this human brain. I know I've shared this perspective before, but we take care of our teeth, we take care of our bodies, we need to take care of our brains. And that has to be a consistent, ongoing thing. It's not like we just have this problem or this condition, we get some help for a little bit and then it just goes away. It's constant self-care and realization. So one of the ways that stigma actually manifests is in parents being sort of in denial of these conditions happening with their children and sometimes themselves. So that's where, if your child is experiencing anxiety, especially due to COVID and this notion of having to go back to school or going back into the world, the first thing I would say is don't push that away and don't be scared of it, even though it can seem scary. Talk, be very open with your communication with your child. The more you talk about it, the more you allow them to share their emotions with you, the better, the more healing and the healthier that environment will be for both the parent and the child. And so, especially when it comes to a little bit older children during adolescence, they really crave that validation of their emotions. And so oftentimes when parents are noticing for the first time that their child might be experiencing anxiety, they want to kind of push that away and not recognize that that's what's happening. And it's what I want to say is it's so much more healthy to embrace it, allow them to talk about it, and then to talk openly and sort of share those feelings. And now another thing that is very healthy in terms of healing for, I think, for all of us, but especially with adults and children, are these different emotion regulation strategies that we teach in the brain and body integration program for Little Humans Big Dreams. And that only comes about by honoring and embracing our emotions and not being afraid of them and running away. And so having those open communications, allowing that child to feel and helping them to identify their emotions, I would say is the first step. And then together you can work on ways, healthy ways of coping and regulating those emotions. And I know you said, well, what can we do as role models? That is one thing that the scientific literature has shown over and over again, that when it comes to pediatric anxiety and depression, what's underlying that many times has to do with emotions, has to do with understanding how to cope with situations that are happening in life. And oftentimes children are looking to us. They're looking to the adult role models. They're trying to look when something like this happens, like a pandemic, what are the adults around me doing? Where are their emotions? Where are their vibrations? And they're very, very aware, sometimes more so than we want them to be.
Yeah, they absorb everything, really.
Right. And so they're going to be looking to you as a, as a parent, or if you have an impact on young children, they're going to be looking at the adults and sort of trying to model them. So one of the ways in which I think that parents can be really helpful during this transition period is to remain calm themselves, to really try to model this, having a positive perspective, a positive outlook on the child going back to school. They can do things like sitting down with them and asking them to share with them what were the things that they loved about school when they were in school, what were the things that they missed doing with their friends, having that kind of open communication, but really focusing on the positive aspects can help to kind of restore that calm and healthy perspective on these social interactions. I know that a lot of adults are struggling with this too, where even people who felt like they loved being around people, they're so used to not being around people. We've talked about this.
Yeah.
When they go out in the world, they're like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And it can be very, very nerve-wracking. And so then we go back to the adult, how we can't help our children if we haven't worked through these things ourselves. And so sometimes that's where you would need to start. You need to try to identify those things in yourself. If you're feeling like, okay, my child's going back to school and I'm freaking out, then we know, okay, we have to start with ourselves. We have to try to implement some of these coping strategies and things that we talk about in the program. And one of the most helpful strategies is really recognizing, we don't have a whole lot of time to get into it, but recognizing that emotions are this form of energy and that they really are running through your body. And if you can honor those feelings and understand where you're feeling them, then you can try to use coping strategies to work through those. And one of the most effective ways that we do this in the BBI program, as you know, is through tapping. And that can be very, very powerful. So it's something that, I've shared with my stepchildren. It's something that a family can do together. And when they see you implementing healthy coping strategies, they'll want to model that. And I would say the next important point would be to focus on that self-care, to model that for them. So a lot of times parents are saying, well, I don't have time for myself. I can't do these things. They're again looking to you. So it's okay to say, I'm struggling today. I'm feeling a lot of anxiety. I'm going to do some meditation. I'm going to do some yoga. I'm going to spend some time by myself. I'm going to go on a walk in nature. And when they see those things, then they realize how important it is for themselves. Again, you're always committing to your mental health and trying to improve yourself. So I think, again, having these open conversations can help a lot.
I love these tips because it's so important, right? Because kids are just absorbing and seeing everything that we're doing. Like if you're a parent, like they're just observing. Like if you don't take care of yourself, then the child is not going to take care of themselves. Exactly. If you have a lot of anxiety, then they're going to have a lot of anxiety.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm not saying to dishonor those feelings of anxiety. What I'm saying is, if you're a parent and you're feeling the anxiety, absolutely share that with your child and then explain or share what you're doing about that. Like, how are you handling that? How are you coping with that? That is so much healthier than trying to stuff it down, pretending it doesn't exist, because that's a very, I would say, almost common strategy for parenting when you're faced with something like this, when it's a situation like a pandemic where you feel like you can't control it as a parent, obviously. Many parents are feeling like they have to push that down and they can't let their child see that they're afraid or they're feeling that anxiety. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying be open about that, share that, but share the coping strategies too, because then the child not only learns, okay, it's okay for me to feel this way. I'm going to be okay, even though I'm feeling anxious. But then they also learn, oh, mom or dad, or, this is how they dealt with this. This is how they are coping. So maybe I can do those things and I'll feel better. And that's where the true learning comes in. And that's where the true healing comes in. I think another aspect that we really have to be aware of is that this whole experience has been really traumatic for all of us and for different people, depending on what has happened as a result. There could be some unprocessed trauma. And so oftentimes, if they're feeling anxiety, depending on what it is, in the general public, we talk about anxiety like it's just this one thing.
Right.
It's a bubble. It's not. There's many, many different ways that anxiety can manifest, and there's many different types of disorders and pediatric disorders. And so what we have to get at is, okay, what is causing this? Could there be trauma that's unprocessed? And if that's the case, then you want to implement strategies to try to process those traumas, and that will help with the anxiety. So that's just something I want to make sure that we touch on, because sometimes parents aren't aware that a situation like this could be very traumatizing. It's not just the anxiety. That trauma can manifest in ways that seem very much like anxiety. But if your child is experiencing panic attacks, so if they're going back to a social environment and then you notice things, they're shaking or they're sweating or suddenly they feel nauseous, that tends to be, it's a separate disorder, but that can tend to be triggered by unprocessed traumas. And so then you want to kind of work through with the child. And again, it's always getting them to talk. It's just communicating, and allowing them to feel safe in that environment to share those feelings, because trauma can be a very sensitive thing. And it could be something they may not even be aware of. So they may have these triggers that they didn't even know. Maybe something happened in a social situation in school back before the pandemic. They've never processed that. And so now they have this unprocessed trauma. They were safe during the pandemic, but now they're going back in that environment and they're having to deal with that for the first time. So it's things like that that as parents, we want to be really aware of. And again, just talking through everything.
So, this is amazing. So I would like us to share like a tapping example that parents can do with their kids. Like, is it good for the parents and the child to do a routine and do it consistently? Like, is this something that it's good to do in the morning or in the evening before bed, or what is your suggestion? Because to your point, it's important to make these things a practice and not just doing it when you don't feel well.
Right. And I think that's a really important point with tapping. That's my perspective, that you should probably start every day with it. And you can end every evening with it, because a lot of times, especially as adults, when our head hits that pillow, that's when all the worries come. That's when all of the things that we haven't really thought about or dealt with throughout the day, that's what keeps us up at night. So if we do tapping right before we sleep, that can help lower that anxiety as well. And so I would recommend, getting absolutely a routine helps. And then that you always have that skill that's just waiting for you should something happen throughout the day. But then don't be afraid to use that should something happen and you do really start to feel, a lot of high anxiety, or, something happens that you're having a hard time processing, and you need to just kind of calm yourself down. So I would absolutely do both.
So is this also something, like, I know you talked about making sure that you talk to your child, like, to help them process what they're feeling? Because a lot of the times especially younger kids, they don't understand what they're feeling. They just have a tantrum. So is tapping a way to like help them calm down and then be able to have a conversation about what they experience if they are just crying out of nowhere?
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. I'm so glad you brought that up. When it comes to anxiety, oftentimes what we're feeling is, as human beings, it's a fear and a deep understanding that there's something that you can't control. And even as little kids, they still they want to believe, as they're developing, that they have some form of control, some sense of control over their own well-being and their own life. And they would never, a lot of times they don't have that language to explain that, but as they're developing, they still sort of subconsciously want that. So if there is something in their environment where it doesn't feel safe, or they feel like there is no control, then they're going to start to feel that anxiety. And as little kids, it is very hard to communicate and share that. So my older sister is amazing at this technique with emotion regulation. She started when her children were very young, on between 1 and 2. And they would start to have, I know it's crazy, it's amazing, it's so inspirational. But they would, if they had a tantrum or if they had an emotional outburst, she would do absolutely that. You start by calming them and then try to get them to communicate in whatever way they can. There's with some young children, they can learn how to sign different things that mean things. So you can try with that, or bodily expressions, and just being really in tune with what the toddler is experiencing. As they get older, they will obviously have some more language. And what we do, as in our program, is really helping children at a young age to identify what those emotions are, so they can communicate and become more aware, which is so much more empowering. That's what emotion regulation strategies allow us to do. These emotions are really your internal compass. They're reminding you and guiding you of who you can be, of your potential, and what you want out of this life. And so they shouldn't be pushed aside, pushed down. They should be fully experienced, but the deeper understanding you have, the healthier you can be, and the better approach you can have in terms of your behavior. So yeah, one of the best ways would be to start young with children, with the tapping to help them to calm down, and then help work through that communication in terms of, okay, can you share what your feelings were? My nephew at the time when this happened was in his high chair and had a little emotional outburst. And when she calmed him down and they could talk in a limited way, she understood that he missed his dad because his dad was at work. Oh. So she made a phone call later during lunch and said, would it make you feel better if you could hear daddy's voice? And he said yes. So a lot of times these little ones might not be able to express or communicate very much, but they can understand what we're saying, our communication. So, even if you just get a yes or no, you're still providing that healthy coping strategy for them. But yet starting at such a young age is so empowering, and just provides them with these tools throughout their lives.
That's amazing.
So one of my favorite tappings is, especially if you're feeling like very, very highly anxious, it can be calming relatively quickly, and it's called the butterfly tap. So you just take your 2 hands like this, you cross them over, and you hook your thumbs like that. You place the hands on your chest, and then you imagine it just like a butterfly that's tapping its wings. And you just go like this, back and forth. And the reason I like it is because it's so simple that little kids can understand this. And sometimes if it doesn't feel as calming, you can tap harder. There's nothing wrong with that. And that can be a little bit more calming. And then you just breathe, you just take deep breaths. They've used this tapping technique during things like Hurricane Katrina, these natural disasters that little kids have, where they've been abandoned or something horrible has happened. And so when emergency personnel have found them and they're working with mental health professionals, they've helped them with this tapping technique. And it's one of my favorite go-tos because it's so simple.
Is it something with like touching your chest? Because I notice sometimes personally when I feel anxious or like fearful, and I just put like my hands over my heart and I talk to myself like, we're okay. Yeah. That helps me personally. But I feel like there's something with like you touching your skin, like over your heart area too, that is very calming.
Yeah, well, there is a different, there's a lot of research in this area. And so if we were to go more into tapping, there's specific regions, depending on what type of situation you're trying to process and go through. But yes, many of us tend to store negative emotions. They've done these incredible studies on this. We tend to store these negative emotions in our chest or in our stomach. And so when you are touching that area, it almost speaks to exactly where you're holding on to that energy in your body. And so in a way, you're kind of letting it go. You can think of it in those terms. Another reason that the butterfly hug or the butterfly tapping can seem so safe is because, yes, there's another area of research that looks at sort of swaddling. Anytime you hug yourself, that is very, very safe. It feels protective. It reminds us of being safe. And some people think it reminds us of sort of just like being in the womb. So when kids are highly, highly anxious, they'll actually use things like a weighted blanket. That pressure on the body helps us to feel safe. So yeah, I think you're probably experiencing a couple of those different components when we do that one.
Amazing. And I know we've talked a lot about younger kids. And before we wrap up, I also want to talk about teens because, they have their emotional outbursts in different ways. Like they might not just randomly start crying, but maybe, they'll see grades start to go down, or maybe they'll start hanging around, a not so healthy group of teens, or start smoking, or start doing drugs, or drinking alcohol. Or is it the same process for teens as younger kids? So can you talk a little bit about that and how, parents can support their teenagers and how teenagers can support themselves during this traumatic time in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I love that you mentioned that, because no, it's different. There's similar aspects, but they're obviously going to be experiencing things differently. It's a completely different stage in life and development, right? But I would say the approach is still the same, that you always go back to open communication. The more that you can openly communicate, and this is the hardest part for parents, especially when it comes to teenagers, refrain judgment. If you can create a safe space for them to talk to you, then you have more to work with together. You can always, if you don't have that information, then there's no way that you can help. And your teenager may push you away, but the more information that you have, if you can't reach them, if you can't help them, then you can help connect them with a professional who can. And so if you don't keep those lines of communication open, you're not going to be able to be there for them in the capacity that you could. One thing that I like to talk about is that, when it comes to teenagers, oftentimes parents struggle with the changes in the brain. I mean, they're profound. They're absolutely profound. And one thing I like to remind parents about is that we have this area of our brain, it's called the prefrontal cortex. And this is like your executive, it's like your CEO. It helps you make all these incredible long-term decisions in your life, analyze, plan. And as we develop into later and later adults, this part of the brain is developing. Well, it doesn't finish developing until on average 27 for men, 25 for women. So when you're looking at teenagers, you have to remind yourself that this part, the part that's really smart and makes really good decisions, is not fully developed yet. It's not even close. But sometimes I think we forget that, because our young people, they can, these adolescents can seem like young adults. And so they'll say things and they'll make good decisions most of the time, and they'll seem like little adults. But you have to remind yourself that that part's not done developing. At the same time, what happens during puberty and a little bit afterwards during adolescence is those emotional centers in the brain, they go crazy. So they're completely elevated, yet this part hasn't caught up. So when they're acting irrational or not making the best decisions, or when their emotions are too intense to us as adults, that's a very normal process in terms of the brain and what's happening for them. And so oftentimes I think parents get annoyed because the teenager might be overreacting or something is such a big deal and they can't understand that. And I always try to remind them, okay, well, think about what's happening in their brain. That's a very normal response. But what bothers me, what I really like to focus on is that what bothers me in that situation is that the child could have experienced something traumatic. And we know that when someone has gone through trauma and they haven't processed it, they are going to react in strange emotional ways. And by that, I mean intensity, sometimes, overreactions, something that might seem like attitude to a parent. And parents automatically want to go to, oh, that's just my teenager, and roll their,
Right.
And I think it's very easy to fall into that as parents, because you've been with them since they were little. They didn't used to act this way. All of a sudden, attitude and talking back and all these things. Well, some of that is development. Some of that is them finding out who they are. Some of that is, defining their boundaries when maybe they didn't really know what they were before. But some of that could be unprocessed trauma. And so anytime that you have an emotional response that's not in accordance with what just occurred, meaning like an opposite emotional response from what you would expect, that's kind of a red flag. And then sometimes when it's just an overly intense expression of something, that's when you might want to open those communication gates again and really, at a later time, sit down and say, hold on, I know that you responded this way when such and such happened. What, is there something going on? Or, can I help you with anything? Or do you want to talk about anything? Because oftentimes there could be something underlying that. So that's something that when it comes to our adolescents, I really want people to be more aware of and not just shake that off as, just being teenagers. Teenagers will be teenagers, but yeah, they definitely have a whole different set of what's bothering them and what they're working through and how they're processing. And especially with this pandemic, I don't want to single out any one group, but for teenagers who are trying to develop into who they are as human beings, and they want to contribute to this society and this world and find their place in it, when we have something like this pandemic that seems to just shatter everything, you have to think about from their perspective what that's like and what they're missing out on. And like I said before, these sort of milestones, proms, graduations, all these things. And so we want to try to help establish a sense of social normalcy with them as much as possible. And so one thing, I know that we had talked about the importance of a routine before we go back, and that can be very hard to do. But what I would say is, as we're gearing to go back to school start at different times, next month, but try to do like a mini routine with your kids, with your teenagers, and say like, hey, I know we've been out of this for a year or so, because that's what has happened. All these teenagers' sleep schedules are completely messed up. They're not sure, what makes sense anymore. It's just gotten really chaotic, and hygiene sometimes, things like that, because they haven't had to be around other people, do their hair and shower and all this stuff. So maybe trying out like a little practice routine at home, and to just, again, be really open with your kids and say, hey, I know that we've all been away from this for a while and you're going to get ready to go back to school. So why don't we do like, just like a family schedule this next week? And let's do something where, okay, at this time we're up, at this time we're all ready, like we're going to get ready like we're going somewhere, and then if the eating structure has changed, we're going to make that more routine for the next week. We're going to establish bathroom schedules again, as if we're all trying to get ready and get out the door, that kind of thing. And in terms of the social anxiety, one of the ways that I think that can help is trying to suggest that they reach out to friends again and reconnect with some of those friends. And they might be doing that through social media already, but trying to help them spark up those conversations again when it might be a little scary. When they go back to school, I think one technique that could help is, in public speaking, I often tell people, if you're talking to a whole room of people and you're terrified, find that one person who's like your anchor. So in most of these kids' experiences, there's been that one person, maybe someone who was always there for them at school. It could be a school counselor, it could be another friend, a peer. And I would say to find that anchor those first few days in that first week back to school, and just spend that time with them. Anytime you start to feel overwhelmed or in the cafeteria, there's too many people, just spend that time with them. And then you can sort of slowly ease your way back into these social interactions with other people.
And would the tapping, like the butterfly, would that be helpful for teens too?
Oh,
If
absolutely.
they're like
Yeah, I've done it.
freaking
I've
out
done
or
it
something?
with my teens. Yeah,
Okay, great.
absolutely helpful. Yeah.
Well, this was amazing. As you know, I love you.
Me too.
We could talk forever, but
I
we're
know.
gonna wrap it up, and we're super excited to bring you more content that is informative. Sabrina has a PhD in neurobiology, right, Sabrina?
Yes.
Yeah, so she is super knowledgeable all about the brain. So we are so excited to share this super important information to help you and your family thrive. So thank you for watching. Thank you, Sabrina. And we're excited to do the next video. So bye, till the next time.